shocks are still possible.
Right, and so you mentioned Unit 4 then, also being at risk for this. I thought that Unit 4, the core was out, and that they have some water back in the pool. What's the concern with Unit 4 at this point?
You're absolutely right. There's no reactor running there. Everything had been taken out and was put in the spent fuel pool. But that means there's no containment either. So the entire spent fuel pool is visible. Literally, when they have those helicopter flyovers, you can look down into this blown-out shell of a building and see the fuel in the spent fuel pool. It's still relatively hot because it only shut down in November. So there's still a lot of decay heat in that pool. Brookhaven National Labs did a study in 1997, and it said that if a fuel pool went dry and caught on fire, it could cause 187,000 fatalities. So it's a big concern, and probably the biggest concern. I know Chairman Yazko of the NRC said that the reason he told Americans to get out from 50 miles out was he was afraid of Unit 4 catching fire. That exposed fuel pool would volatilize plutonium, uranium, and cesium and strontium. And if the Brookhaven study is to be believed, could kill more than 100,000 people as a result.
And this from the effects of radiation or long-term cancer exposures? Something we'll get into in a minute.
Yeah, hot particles from long-term cancer exposure.
Okay, so we've had these 4 units. Each of them has sort of had their own crisis, and each of them has released contamination into the environment. First, how much contamination really got released here? Second, we see that a bunch of it's headed into the ocean, although we're still, I think questioning how much is where it all is. So my question is around how much contamination is around these buildings at this point in time, and what are the challenges, and what happens when, not if, but when typhoon season comes up? Say we had a sort of a large onshore kind of a storm, would that create sort of issues? I'm just trying to play out how much has been released, how much might be released, and what it actually implies at this point in time.
Well, this event is, I've said, is worse than Chernobyl, and I'll stand by that. There was an enormous amount of radiation given out in the first 2-3 weeks of the event. And had the wind been blowing inland, this would be, it could very well have brought the nation of Japan to its knees. I mean, it was, there's so much contamination that luckily wound up in the Pacific Ocean compared to across the nation of Japan. It could have cut Japan in half. But now the winds have turned, so they're heading to the south toward Tokyo. And, my concern and my advice to friends is that if there's a severe aftershock and the Unit 4 building collapses, leave. We're well beyond where any science has ever gone at that point, and nuclear fuel lying on the ground and getting hot is not a condition that anyone has ever analyzed. So the plants, you'll see them steaming, and as the summer goes on, you'll see them steaming less because the air is warmer. But it's not because they're not steaming. You just don't see it because this event occurred in March and it was cool there, so you'll see a plume a lot easier. Those plants are still emitting a lot of radiation, nowhere near as much as on the first 2 weeks, but a lot of radiation, cesium, strontium, and mainly cesium and strontium. Those are going to head south, whether or not there's a hurricane, tropical hurricane. The wind is going to push it south this time, and so the issue is not the total radiation you might measure with a Geiger counter in your hand, but hot particles.
Well, there was already, I was taken aback when I read the reports that in some prefectures right around Tokyo, they'd found some what I consider to be pretty hot readings. 3,000 or 4,000 becquerels in the soil, 170,000 becquerels in some kind of a fly ash, or they found some in sludge as well. But I think the higher reading was from some sort of ash, which means it came through an incinerator or some sort of burning process. I thought those were pretty shocking levels because I hadn't really been informed that the winds had shifted south long enough and enough contamination had made it that far in order to get readings like that. So I felt fairly confused, as if I didn't have a good understanding of how much might have gotten there or how it got there or when it got there. and that they'd found those readings in March, and of course they didn't release the data until sometime towards the end of April. Did you follow that part, and what do you make of readings like that?
Yes, I followed it, and I am as confused as you are. Individuals have sent Fairewinds some car air filters from Tokyo, and they turn out to be one of the ideal ways of measuring radiation because they trap a lot of these hot particles. And we had one person sent us 7 filters, and they ran a body shop or something, and 5 of the filters were fine, and 2 were incredibly radioactive. So what that tells me is that the plume was not regular, and you'll have places where there was not much deposition, and you'll have places where there was a lot of deposition. That same thing happened up to the north, but within Tokyo, it seems like wherever the official results were being reported didn't really represent the worst conditions of the plume. And I saw that on 3 Mile Island. We shouldn't be surprised that a plume meanders and that a plume may miss a major radiation detector by a quarter of a mile, and it's not detected. Doesn't mean it's not there. It means we just didn't detect it.
Sure, this is fluid dynamics. When you put a drop of dye in a glass of water and watch it swirl around, obviously it more ends up in some places than others. So that's part of it. And anybody's looked at the aftermap of Chernobyl all across Belarus and Ukraine and whatnot. I mean, it's obviously not a big circle. It's a very, very convoluted map of deposition. So that's part of it. I guess I was surprised because I hadn't heard of any warning signs that amount could have been deposited that far south yet, but there it was. So that was pretty interesting to me.
What happened there was the plume went out to sea, but then curved south and then west. It actually came in like a hook, so that when you were measuring what was happening at Fukushima, it appeared that the plume was heading out to sea, but then offshore the winds took it south and then west into Tokyo, and it contained the particles we're picking up in air filters are strontium and cesium and americium, which is an indication of fuel failures.
Right, and maybe that was the same plume that I remember was South Korea actually shut some schools down because it was raining at the time and they had a lot of radiation coming down. So we know that there was a big south and then west hooking in order for it to get there. So maybe that was part of that one process. But it speaks to something, which is that these plumes that are coming up and out of contaminated plumes with radioactive particles in them are pretty hot. As you might expect. I remember the reactor that was scaring me the most for a while was number 2, which looked sedate. It had this little hole in the side, but it was just constantly emitting steam, constantly, for a whole period of time. And I knew what was in that steam. It was going to be pretty hot, I thought.
Unit 2 has gotten to the point where it can't get any worse because it's now laying at the bottom of containment, and the containment has a hole in it. That doesn't mean that it's not really bad still. It just can't get any worse. The concern now is this enormous amount of water that's being used to cool these reactors, tens of tons an hour. And the original plan was to recirculate the nuclear reactor water through the nuclear reactor, and on the other side have a heat exchanger that took the heat away, so you wouldn't generate any water. In fact, we've got hundreds of thousands of tons of radioactive water, and it's not mildly radioactive. And here's the problem: if you were to demineralize this or filter this, the filters and demineralizers would become so radioactive that the filters might melt because they're made of a plastic material. And the other part of it is that the personnel couldn't get near the filters to change them. So it's a very difficult problem. What do you do with all of this contaminated water? The large volume and the high radioactivity make getting rid of that water very difficult.
So, I'd like to talk about the other challenges they face, too. I mean, I don't know what they're going to do with all that water, and I don't think they do either. They're pumping it into a big storage tank right now, and I just read that maybe that's leaking, or at least some water went out of it, so one guess is it's leaking. Talk to us about what are the other challenges that those engineers and cleanup crews are going to be facing. What's the work environment like there right now?
Yeah, we are not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. The people outside are wearing completely enclosed clothing taped to their faces, and they have respirators on. The respirators are designed, as a charcoal filter, but they're breathing through their lungs, and they're taking the air from the outside through those respirators. It's hot, it's sticky, and you're constantly looking at this radiation gauge, but it's something that, while uncomfortable, probably isn't lethal. The people that are going in are a different problem. They're going in essentially a bubble suit, and they have their own self-contained air, like a fireman in a fire. A Scott air pack is sort of what they're called. So they're going in with their own self-contained air into a place that has no lights, into a place that has water everywhere, a place that's dark with rubble, and on top of that, it's highly radioactive. And they're probably carrying 30 or 40 pounds worth of gear to do whatever it is they were sent in there for. The stay time in that environment, it would be tough. If there were no radiation, it's a hot, sticky, pretty miserable place to work for an hour or so. But the radioactivity levels are so high that these guys are being chased out on the order of 15 minutes. And they're receiving an exposure which is roughly equivalent to the worst an American worker would get over 5 years. These guys are picking up in 10 minutes.
So let's assume that they do actually have I think they've bumped it up to 250 millisieverts as an annual dose limit now. So once a worker gets to, say, that threshold, then what?
Hopefully they are no longer allowed to receive any more radiation, period, not just for a year or for a month, but they really shouldn't receive any more than that. Here's a general rule of thumb is 250 rem will kill you. So that means that if 10 people get 25 rem, one of them will develop a cancer. And if 100 people get 2.5 rem, one of them will get a cancer. So it doesn't mean lesser doses assure you of not getting a cancer. So what these people are doing is they're increasing the likelihood that they'll get a cancer. 250 millisieverts is 25 rem, by the way. I'm sorry. But they're increasing the likelihood, every time they pick up that exposure, they're increasing the likelihood that they'll get a cancer by 10%.
Right, and so, gosh, I read some of the readings that I saw in there are pretty scary, hot readings. So they're definitely all the way up in the 1 sievert zone for some of the areas, and some are hotter and all of that. So we've got these damaged buildings. They're sending people in. My concern has been that there are only so many people who are trained to work in those facilities, so they know them well, know the systems, know the parts, know how to even navigate the hallways. Once they've gone through and used up their allotment of radiation exposure, they're done, right? And then I guess they train the next people to go in. And one thing that's concerned me is I know that when Chernobyl went, Russia just threw hundreds of thousands of people at it in small little bits and to clean that up. Here we're seeing a very different response. It's much more measured. They're relatively small teams by my eye. I look at satellite photos. I don't see hundreds of thousands of people converging on that. I see a pretty focused response. How long is it going to take with a focused response like that to get this job done, do you think?
The Russians needed thousands of people because large fragments of the fuel had fallen on the surrounding farmland. So literally people would pick up a fragment in a wheelbarrow and run toward where the reactor was, throw that fragment into the reactor pit, and they were done. They had received their lifetime exposure. In this case, while the radiation is not contained, it's not coming out of solid particles that can get picked up. It's going out as liquid.